Hi, this is Craig Stocks, and this is my critique of the day. I'm a big believer in critiques as a way to learn and improve our photography, and it really doesn't matter so much if it's your photo being critiqued or if you're listening to a critique of someone else's photo. There's still a lot to learn, and even if you take the time to really look at your own photos with a critical eye and kind of critique your own photo, it's a good opportunity to kind of maybe dig a little deeper into some of the pictures that you've done. The most important thing is to approach any critique with an open mind, because whether you agree or disagree, you're always likely to learn something. So think of it as an opportunity to learn what someone else thinks, even if they're wrong. So in this case, I'm going to look at a photo that I took about a year ago. This happens to be a sunset photo, although it could be either a sunrise or a sunset. The first thing that strikes me about the photo is the color, and because it's a sunset image, it should be a colorful image, and I tend to think that colorful scenes should be portrayed in colorful photos, and this one certainly is. I think the color is bright and saturated, but not overly garish. Overall, I think the image has a good balance from side to side. It's balanced left to right, but it also has a good balance from top to bottom. So there's things going on in the foreground, there's things going on in the background, in the sky. One of the first things I tend to look at with any kind of a landscape image is the horizon. In this case, the horizon is level, which is good because horizons should be level unless it's being tilted specifically for some artistic intent. But in general, in a landscape image, that's something that is easy to correct either with the camera or in post-processing. And it's something that really jumps out at me if the horizon is tilted a little bit. So that's something to be careful of. Excuse me. Generally, the rule of thumb with the horizon line is it should be at the top third or the bottom third, depending on which is more interesting, the foreground or the sky. So if the sky is more interesting, you would normally place the horizon line low so that you have most of the image taken up with the sky. Just the opposite would be true if the foreground is more interesting. The case for placing the horizon near the center would be if the foreground and the background are equally interesting. And I think you could argue in this case that the rocks in the foreground create an anchor that makes the foreground equally interesting to the sky. So, it's probably more acceptable to have the horizon near the center, but that is something to think about. One thing to look at with the sky, though, it's getting to the point where maybe it's a little bit too dark. And whether that's done in post-processing or with a graduated neutral density filter on the camera, I think you want to be careful that you keep bright areas bright and dark areas dark. And this is starting to get to the point where the sky is darker than the foreground and it starts to look a little bit unnatural. Now, the reason for having a dark sky is in order to have those rich saturated colors, because as colors become lighter, they become less saturated and less intense. So it's a bit of a balancing act. It might be a good opportunity to explore letting the foreground go a little bit darker if we want the sky this dark so that there's a better balance between the foreground and the background. Another option would be to let the sky go a little bit brighter in some areas so that it better balances the foreground. And that's something that's subjective. Another thing that you can look at is reflections. Reflections should always be darker than the thing being reflected. And here we can see the reflection in the water is getting brighter than the sky. So that's again a tip-off that the sky might be a little bit too dark. As I look at the rocks in the foreground, they certainly add interest and add an anchor to the foreground. I kind of feel like they're a little bit too far down in the frame. That I think this would have been a stronger image if I had used a lower camera angle. And that would have done a couple of things. It would have maybe let me get closer to the rocks so they become more prominent in the foreground. And it also would have let me minimize the amount of dead space that the water's taking up between the rocks and the sky, so that I would have a larger area of rocks in the foreground and less water in the middle, which is kind of dead space. And I think that would have made the image a little bit more interesting. The other thing that I see in this, looking at it now, is it seems to be a little bit too centered. That you've got the rocks in the center, the sun is almost in the center here, so all of the interest is happening right here, that it probably would have been a more dynamic image if I had placed the sun more over in the left side of the image so that it was coming in at an angle rather than directly onto the rocks. And I think that might have made a more dynamic image. The last thing I think I look at is I always look around the edges. And you can see there's some pretty contrasty bits of depressions in the sand, via shell or some coral that's washed ashore, something bright here on the bottom. And those create distractions along the edge. So again, I think I could improve the image by either cropping just a little bit in to crop those out, or expanding the crop a little bit to give a little bit more space in the foreground and let these dark spots be further into the center of the image. If you're open to working with Photoshop and changing the image, there's certainly some things you could do to use the clone stamp or healing brush to remove some of these distractions along the edge, and probably rescale the image a little bit to make the rocks larger and minimize the amount of space that the water takes up, and maybe even slide the sky over a little bit to the left to create a little bit more dynamic image. But those are some somewhat nitpicky things that overall I think it is a successful image. I don't know that I will print it to hang it on the wall anywhere, but I think it has a lot of good things going for it. It captures the scene, it shows the sky, which was an interesting sunset that night, and it does follow the general idea of having a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. So I think it's overall a successful image. I hope you found this informative and useful, and I would certainly invite you to participate. Share your comments below, and in particular, if you have an image you'd like me to review, send it to me in a Facebook instant message, and I'd love to have some more images to look at so that we can all kind of review them and think about what makes them successful and where are areas for improvement. If you do send me an image to be reviewed, let me know if you'd like me to give you credit for the image or if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Thanks, and everybody have a great day.